This is the Infrastructure Matters podcast, brought to you by the Futurum Group. We explore the latest developments in hybrid cloud computing and the technology that underpins it. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the latest trends and technologies that are shaping the hybrid cloud computing landscape. The Infrastructure Matters podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Please do not take anything reflected in this show as investment advice. Now your co-hosts, Stephen Dickens, Camberley Bates, and Krista Maycumber of the Futurum Group.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Infrastructure Matters. And Steve and I today, we are going to go and break down some of the big earnings or kind of the issues around the big earnings and that kind of thing. And we're going to talk Google, which is overwhelming. Google next.
Exactly. Hey, Camberley.
It's crazy. So it's been a huge earnings last couple of weeks, and we have lots of those reports on what those numbers look like and everything else. But from an analyst perspective, I go and tear down and really like to look at the Q&As and those things and focus on what are some of the big trends that they're seeing. So I'm going to talk about a couple of them. Dell was one of the biggest ones. They did a stellar reporting, 22.9 billion, and I thought this was cool, 2 billion in operating income. Like that number. Very, very sweet. A lot of this is driven by the AI initiatives. So you might have remembered they announced their box, the 9680, which was this big 6U box that's got GPUs and CPUs and everything else in there. And that has got a huge backlog now. Which we're hearing about everybody, about a $2 billion backlog on that item. They had a really strong performance. Now, I found this was interesting in their ISG group. I don't focus on the PC business. We focus on the infrastructure and the data centers. ISG is where the servers and the storage are. And what performed for them there was their HCI offering and PowerFlex. Now, I don't know if you know what PowerFlex was. PowerFlex was this thing called Scale IO that almost got killed when it was still with EMC. And when Dell bought them, they kind of looked at it. I think Jeff Clark actually looked at it and said, this is really cool software. And that has now just super taken off. So that's probably some of the biggest stuff that we're seeing there. They are saying that they picked up a lot of business with the SMB and the government institution. You guys are the big companies, the big enterprises are still kind of doing the cautious thing about what you're buying and purchasing and that sort of stuff. So that's, a little bit of a difference that's going there. I'm not sure, Steve, if you're hearing anything about that, but I'll just pass it on to you for a comment.
Well, I think it's really interesting, AI's kind of captured the market zeitgeist since, OpenAI came out, what was that, November last year. It's interesting that this is probably the first quarter. We're going to talk about HPE's numbers as well. It's probably the first quarter where some of that shipment data is starting to reflect itself in their quarterly earnings. So, I think some of the stuff you talked about there around that 6U box that they've got, what was it, the 9800?
9680.
9680. I think it's going to be interesting. A $2 billion backlog on one server type. I was having a similar conversation with Kirk Skaugen from Lenovo last week. Anything with NVIDIA GPUs in it right now is huge for these guys. So I think the rest of their business kind of up and to the right, good projections of growth. Anything AI, double digits, triple digits growth, some of these new products coming to market. So I think, maybe that's a trend for the next 4-6 quarters, maybe. So I think that's good for these vendors. And you're starting to see that reflected in Dell. And, we're going to bounce onto HPE, who also reported this week.
And there is one of the things that Jeff Clark had talked about, and we've seen some of the technology that's going to be coming out, which is on the PC side of it. And that could have, they're looking at chips that enable for the AI inferencing as well as the training within the PC. That will, once those come out, we're going to see an engine move onto that side of the house as well. Right now, that's still depressed, as we're trying to absorb all the stuff that we shipped during the COVID period. The second, and I haven't gone all the way through the stuff, but I'll just touch a little bit on HPE's their announcements. Their big lift on their numbers, which was coming from the GreenLake, their GreenLake offering, and their Intelligent Edge, which had a stellar quarter. And that's where their biggest piece of it. But some of the pieces that I pulled out of their conversations, they too are seeing the same kind of thing, where the enterprise organizations, particularly on the server side, are hesitant still, and elongated kind of decision cycles environment. Of course, their Cray group, their HPC group, is kind of like going through and shipping. They were not up as high as I would have expected to be. It's only about a 3% bump, but they're the traditional guys that they're already in cycles. So that's pretty decent, pretty good earnings coming from them. The third one I'll mention is Nutanix. For those guys who don't know, Nutanix is their HCI offering. So if you remember, Dell, built by HCI. So there's really two big HCIs now. One is Dell's VxRail, and the other one is Nutanix Space. Kind of the big lenses on them are a couple things. One, VMware Broadcom. So they have an offering that's an alternative. They ship VMware integrated into their systems, but they also have their own VM environment. So one of the questions is coming out, okay, so are you seeing an uptick now that it looks like the Broadcom VM thing is going away because people are saying we're concerned about the price raising? They haven't quite seen it yet, but they're having a lot of inquiries on it. The other trend that was good, and by the way, they had some really good earnings. They're about a $2 billion run rate now, slightly less than that, but really good numbers that are coming out. The other trend, near and dear to your heart, Stephen, is repatriation. So I know you're always wanting to talk about that. So the question came. I love these financial analysts. The question came: are you seeing repatriation? And the answer was not really. That was not exactly the answer, but what they are seeing, which is really interesting, is they have an offering now that is up in the cloud. So they have their software. You can have your on-prem box, and you have your NC2, I believe is what it is, up in the cloud. Now, customers are looking to use that because they need to spend down the contracts that they have with AWS and also Azure. And I've heard that also from some other folks that I can't get out of this contract if I negotiate my contract down for my spend with the big cloud companies, they're going to drop my discount. So I'm motivated to spend that money. How can I spend it? Well, I can spend it by doing some things like, okay, so I have this, I'm not going to put it on prem, I'm going to put it up there, and I'll spend my money up there. So it's kind of an interesting twist.
Yeah, it's interesting that came up. We're going to talk about Google, but that whole topic came up this week. There's a 25% cap on what you can spend on your AWS contract of what you can spend in the marketplace. So you've got to spend 70. I didn't know this, so this is why I'm sharing it. You've got to spend 75% of your contract on Amazon stuff. You can only spend 25% on third-party stuff like Nutanix. In GCP, there is no limit. You could spend it all on other stuff. Now, obviously, you probably won't do that, but there's not that hard cap. Interesting. I mean, it was a two or three people asked questions on it this week. So if analysts are asking questions on it, it kind of speaks to it pricking your interest as well. And, people are looking at that topic, I think.
Well, that's really good. Actually, that's kind of good news for NetApp because, as you guys may know, that NetApp they're a first-class citizen in all three of the platforms. So AWS, Azure, and Google, and as much as those companies are treating their offering as their product is not a marketplace offering. So that's very, very good for them and should bode well over time. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay, so are you ready? Guys, audience here, drum roll. I want to give you an idea about how big the announcements were from this last week, and there's no way that we can cover it. So I still print out all my stuff, and this is from Regina Hoshimi, who heads up the AR. So there's page 1, there's page 2, there's page 3, and page 4. Now, every one of those are 3-line items. So 3-line items outlining something that they announced this week. And you said how many were there?
So give some context.
I think there's more than, you said 48. There's more than 48 on here.
Well, that was just the info. So we're talking about Google Cloud next. I've been out there with Daniel this week. Google's big event in San Francisco. I think there was 15,000 people there. The keynote had 8,000 seats, so I know, and it was packed. There was people standing at the back with Sundar kicking it off. Jensen Huang from NVIDIA joined the stage as well. So, I mean, what Camberley's talking about, we get sent briefs on all the announcements, and the document that the email that Regina, who runs Analyst Relations, sent us is literally like one sentence on each announcement, and those are the big announcements that we should be careful about. You'll have seen a lot of coverage from our team. We had to mobilize on Monday and just go, there is so much. We've probably written, I would say, 10 research notes this week on all the Google announcements, and we've barely scratched the surface. I've got something going live today that we'll put a link to in the show notes. My summaries of announcements are typically 800 to 1,000 words. My summary from Google, trying to summarize everything, 1,800 words I wrote yesterday.
Okay. So we got to get into the details because they don't want to hear about our pain.
I know. I mean, okay, I'm just trying to give some context. I know. I mean, trying to cover these events for you guys and give you content that's kind of condensed is a nightmare, but we'll dive straight in. I mean, so
one of the cool things I saw, and then I'm going to go and let you go through the other pieces, is that all these customer partnerships news were announcing a whole lot of generative AI partnerships with them. So if I can read a couple of the companies, Fox Sports, GE Appliances to generate custom recipes for you. Geez, I don't know. GM, IHOP guys. They're doing something with Google to get generative AI going and recommendations. Six Flags, so get people running around the place. So those are some of the big names. Bayer or Bayer, however you want to call them, and on medical kind of items, tuning the LLM. So those are some of the big names that we're partnering with them that went on, that have been up there. So let's talk about the technology.
Well, just to add some of the names on the show floor, they had a booth from Wendy's talking about the collaboration that they're doing with Wendy's at the drive-through. The ability for you to be able to go up, sort of, and order your Wendy's. And everybody scrambles that, and they don't mention the product name. So it was a really sort of advanced natural language case. They also had a booth from Deutsche Bank talking about 3 or 4 different use cases of generative AI. So it's unusual to see enterprises on an expo show floor. So that was kind of cool. So let's try and parse this through. Infrastructure and tools. First off, as I mentioned, Jensen joined Thomas Kurian, the CEO of Google Cloud, on stage. Jensen rocking his leather jacket as always, talking about the A3 VMs, leveraging the H100 GPUs. Also heard about new TPU instances from Google, so that custom silicon. One of the key takeaways was Google is doing everything full stack when it comes to generative AI. So right from custom silicon right up to their own large language models. There was Google Kubernetes Enterprise, so their own enterprise Kubernetes distribution, lots of focus there. One of the other key announcements at the sort of technology level was the Google Cloud Network, Cross Cloud Network, which is really trying to focus in on hybrid and multi-cloud type deployments. I think it was really
So
interesting.
is that yeah, go ahead. Is that anything like what VMware had been talking about?
A little bit from VMware Explore.
Yeah,
I think
the ability to define the policy and then move across the cloud.
it
From
was it was kind of that, a little bit more on the network bandwidth layer,
okay, yeah, that's
and I think it's an acknowledgement, and it was really interesting to hear Google talk about it, acknowledging that they may be in third place, and that people are going to be able to want to think about, okay, maybe I've got a concentration on Azure and an AWS, but I want to use Google for what they're positioning themselves to be a market leader as AI. How do I combine those services? And how do I think about sort of the network bandwidth between those services and moving data between those services? Again, pretty detailed announcement, but really sort of focus in there from those guys, which I thought was really interesting. So those were the sort of big three from an infrastructure and tools, sort of GPU, TPU, the Kubernetes stuff, and then the cross network. The other piece was lots of announcements around Google Vertex. They're really sort of supercharging that space. Talking about Palm 2, Imogen, Kodi upgrades.
so. Talk about what is Vertex first of all. It's
Well, this is their overall platform for AI. This is kind of where. So this is their enterprise AI platform. This is a bunch of large language models that they've developed. They announced a whole bunch of collaborative partnerships to partner with open source models and a number of different vendors. So it's really that if an enterprise wants to deploy AI, how do they do that? I saw a great demo. You mentioned NetApp, being able to take your enterprise data that sits on your filers, your ONTAP environment, put a Vertex enterprise AI layer on top of that, and then being able to provide query your enterprise data in a natural language way. So instead of going out and doing a chat GPT and they had a side by side comparison running in the demo, you go out and ask it a question, it goes and searches the public internet and pulls you back an answer. Well, that's kind of maybe valuable. But if you've got a better answer in your data internally sitting on your NetApp environment, coupling that with Vertex to be able to get an internal view is going to be fascinating. So I think we're at the early days of that. They announced Vertex, I think, a few months back. This is really where it's coming out of public, but test and really starting to be supercharged.
Yeah, and so what I will comment on two items here on the partnerships with people like Meta for the Llama technology, a bunch of other
Llama
people.
without the drama was the best sentence said this week on
Oh dear God!
Llama without the drama. I tweeted it. It made me chuckle. It kind of sums it up, though.
Okay, so they have something called, I believe it's called a modern garden, and that garden is where you go and farm for your different large language models. So they're tapping into all the different large language models plus their own. I also understand that Sergey has come back and is working full time and overtime developing theirs. So they are just hammering away on this to come out with the competitive environment. But that's what's in there. The second thing I'll mention, since you talked about NetApp, I'll give them a shout out here. NetApp announced their first class citizen capability for ONTAP storage with Google.
That was the demo. That was what drew me to the booth and ended up getting me that demo. So yeah, I think because they had AWS and Azure, and then they announced the sort of first party service in GCP. So that you were right. The model garden is what they're calling it, and I think they made a really strong point of it's not just our large language models, and they announced I think it was 5 or 6 different partnerships during the keynote with all of the big names you would expect. Kahir was there. I'm trying to remember some A121. There was a whole bunch of others that they dropped. As I say, we're still digesting a bunch of these announcements. The other one that kind of stood out for me was Duet AI. This is kind of how they're bringing AI to Google Docs, Gmail, Google Slides, Google Meet, and really sort of supercharging the experience. They've had some of this in sort of beta. Now that's starting to come through. I think it's really some of the demos were really interesting from a personal level. We're a Gmail and G Suite user here internally. We've started to obviously had AI for a while, finishing and suggesting sentences for our email, but seeing that extend. And I think the interesting takeaway for enterprises that, this is at a personal level, but one thing that came through for me was that Google's been doing AI at billion user scale for years. They've had AI into some of their public facing services like Gmail and YouTube, now starting to bring that through. So I think for those G Suite users, that's going to be interesting.
I read through that, looked at a couple of the demo kind of stuff that was going on there. I had 2 things because I'm a super paranoid person when it comes to security. I mean, how many backups do I have of my stuff at home? 6, okay? Actually, I think it's only 5, but anyway. So
multi-vendor strategy for backup, knowing you as well, yeah.
Yeah, so but here is where I went. It's like, okay, so I'm going to put Duet AI on my Google Mail, my Google Docs, my Google Chat, and it's going to do all that analysis. How do I know that it's not seeking out and leaking out to the NSA? That I'm sorry, that's right. I'm not kidding. I'm in a very serious mode. Is that having assurance that I know they're already probably scraping certain stuff, but it makes it even more
Well, I think,
interesting
I mean,
on a privacy element. I mean, they did talk about in their announcement the privacy and everything else, and I'm like going, okay, so
they lent into responsible AI as kind of a key guiding foundational principle. There was a whole section that we got briefed on this. They've decided to be really intentional about where they apply AI, how they apply it. They've decided not to do things from a commercial point of view because they believe it doesn't align with their principles. We've got a whole kind of Google is an ethical company pitch, and I mean, yes, it's a pitch, but it came through in every session. Responsible AI. So I think you're right to have some of those concerns. I think I came away with Google's listening to those concerns and is being intentional about what it's doing. So I think really going to be fascinating to see that come through. Some really quick use cases on kind of how to level up charts, how to sort of um, do queries amongst your Google Docs. Some really fascinating sort of use cases. So much so that I'm sitting there opposite Daniel and we're texting going, we need to use this. We need a demo from Google on how we use this internally.
So, and that I thought about that too, because we've been using, we've been playing around with the different tools and using the different tools. Plus, we're developing our own internal capability with, taking all of our data that we have from our research, dropping it in there, potentially releasing that next year. The thing I was kind of surprised at, and I thought it was a bit pricey, but maybe not. $30 a person, $30 a seat is what it came out as. And then I thought, okay, so what is ChatGPT charging in order to have an enterprise, or kind of stuff. So it's probably aligned. Um, but I still thought that was, when you think about it's on top of your Gmail account and everything else, and you look at it from an enterprise class kind of stuff, it's not cheap.
I think we're going to, I mean, this aligns with where Microsoft was with some of their announcements with their
Hmm.
pricing kind of is expensive, but in line. I think
Yes.
just over time, as it comes pervasive, you're going to see that erode. I still think you're going to see a premium for these services, and I think that's good directionally for these vendors. But as it gets rolled out, it's going to be interesting to see. So that was the next one. The other one that was really fascinating for me was the Unified Data and AI Foundational Platform, and specifically what they're doing with Alloy DB, which is a component of Google's Postgres compatible database service. Lots of announcements there, but
But tell me about that, because I don't know. Tell me more.
yeah. So obviously the data centricity, everybody, all these cloud providers are trying to get you to put their data on their cloud. This was the combination with BigQuery as well, where I think Google's got a strong leadership position. The interesting thing that came out from me in the announcement was, and they said it on main stage, they said it in breakout sessions, they are going after your Oracle data and want to proactively move that to Alloy DB, get people out of an on-premise Oracle database instance, move that to a open source based, but ultimately Google service in Alloy DB. I think, and I wrote this in my research note, I think that's going to be an interesting approach. Lots of people are very attached to their Oracle databases and have put a lot of time, effort, and resources into tuning those. It's where a lot of their enterprise data sits. Oracle's doing a really good job of transitioning that legacy base onto Exadata, onto an Exadata connected to OCI, and then putting those instances ultimately into the cloud. So that there's a kind of nice movement of getting you to the cloud with Oracle's core product without having to move database. I think whilst Google's approach made sense and the technology kind of stacks up, that's going to be a tough lift to get people off Oracle.
Well, and I would agree, and Thomas Kurian knows that because he's formerly of Oracle, right? Um,
Right thing
but
for Google to
but
do,
each
hard to
each of
pull off.
the yeah, but each, for instance, AWS has their own offering that is, going after directly after the big red, and they have been, hard pressed to on moving that. So they're really, what they're more looking at is people that are going to take an application and possibly rewrite it, redesign it, and I need a database that will enable that to happen. And that's, I think, is where that direction is going. It's not a just plug and push, because databases are as sticky as data protection, if not stickier.
Well, it was
So,
interesting. They announced all this stuff, but they were very intentional about saying it was a migration offering off Oracle, which I thought was, whilst it makes sense, it's going to be interesting to watch that play out. I'm not saying that technology wouldn't work. There's just, a lot of focus there. Um, Other thing that sort of came through, and you touched on it from security, but applying AI to a SecOps platform, the Security Command Center, really being able to, there was a number of demos from an observability point of view around how do they use the AI to be able to sort of improve that SecOps sort of process. Partnerships with Palo Alto Networks as well. So I think from a security perspective, I don't know whether Google get as much credit as maybe they deserve for being in that observability kind of space,
mhm.
but going to be interesting. Also announced some assured workloads for their Japan region. Um, you know, data residency, the sovereign cloud type approach. So some interesting things there. As I say, a lot of announcements. Our team's done a bunch of research notes. I think it's going to take us at least the next month to digest everything that's come through. But that's a quick run through of the big sort of big items for me.
Well, the other thing that struck me, it seemed like most of these were not previews. There was some preview, but a lot of it was GA work.
You get the impression that I mean, Thomas Curran spent some time with us, which is always great when the CEOs sort of spend some time one-to-one with the analysts in a closed door. I think the thing that came away from that session for me, and maybe a couple of the other sessions, was Google knows that the way for them to get into the race with AWS and Azure is AI. Now's the moment. This is the if anybody's going to capitalize on the AI moment for public cloud, it's going to be Google. So you get the impression that the organization is laser focused on get product to market, get it there quick, make sure it's fantastic, because this is how we win in the cloud wars.
And I think last week we talked about this concept about, I've got an on-premise environment and I have a cloud environment. And each of those has to have a different separate infrastructure team because they are different. I don't care how, even if I have an ONTAP data everywhere, I still have other things that are going to be different. Or if I have one VMware environment, those VMware environments are different in an AWS than it is in a Azure. And so, in talking to folks saying, no, I don't want a third cloud because I've got too much now. And then what you brought up is like, well, there may be other options. And so this for Google, they have been seen as the key guys for any kind of AI type of effort, data analytics type of effort, because they've been seen as the premier folks. So you're absolutely right. This is their way of saying, okay, so I, bite the bullet. I have to be a third cloud because these are the guys that have got, the speed to market is critical. That's why people use the cloud to begin with, is how fast I can get to market, how fast I can move. And this is clearly, right in their, this is their their playing field. So they should be able to execute very, very well in this space.
Yeah, and I think it's that full stack approach, everything from TPU right up to large language model. Microsoft's not doing custom silicon. Obviously, AWS is with Inferentia and Trainium, but I think they've got a complete stack model. And they claim they're the only vendor that's got that complete stack model for AI. I think whilst that's obviously marked in hyperbole, it's actually true. So I think, they've got the ability to compete, and you get the impression they know it. This is the way for them to supercharge their sort of cloud presence and drive some market share.
Okay, well, we've burned another half an hour.
When you've got so many announcements, it goes quick, right?
It absolutely does. So it's amazing. Last week of August, and we have this much to talk about.
Yeah.
So our European friends should train the Americans not to do this, but they're just coming back to next week from their vacation. So there we go. All right, guys, thank you very much for joining us. Make sure you follow us. We'll put some of the, I guess, if not all of the research notes and the notes here, so you guys can grab those as well. Otherwise, thank you very much for tuning in. And Steve, thank you.
Fantastic. Cheers, Camberley. We'll see you next week.
Okay, take care.